The fire didn't just burn, it screamed. It snapped like a dry bone breaking in the bitter wind, and right in the middle of it all stood Clara Ara Whitlow. She was frozen, caught in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. On one side of the flames was her father, his face a mask of cold indifference. On the other side was him, the Apache warrior. His eyes were like chips of dark flint, steady and unblinking, and they were fixed right on her. She didn't dare move. She didn't even shift her weight from one tired foot to the other. She just stared at the frozen ground, praying it would crack open and swallow her whole. Her hands were balled into fists, clutching the thin gray wool of her shawl. Everything she owned was thin and gray. Dust clung to the hem of her dress like a second skin. A smudge of ash decorated one cheek like a cruel joke. She knew she wasn't pretty. Her nose was crooked from a fall she took as a child. Her cheeks were hollow from too many missed meals. Her hair, long and unbrushed, was held back by a rusted brooch that dug into her scalp. She was not a thing of beauty or softness. She knew this because her family had reminded her of it every single day of her life. "She's quiet," her father said, his voice flat and empty. He wasn't even looking at her. He was talking to the warrior, Chaser, like he was selling a piece of livestock. "Strong, doesn't complain. I've got 5 others to feed." Chaser didn't answer. He just stood there, a silent statue wrapped in a weathered cloak. 2 long, dark braids rested on his shoulders like sleeping snakes. After a long, agonizing moment, he gave a single, small nod. That was it. He stepped forward, his movements fluid and silent. He dropped a bundle on the frozen earth between them. There was no ceremony, no handshake, no kind words, just the soft thud of the bundle hitting the ground. Inside were 2 tanned pelts, a coil of thick sinew rope, and a pair of heavy iron horseshoes. That was the price. That was what she was worth. A deal was a deal. And Clara Ara Whitlow was the merchandise. Her stomach felt like it was full of angry hornets, but she didn't make a sound. What was the point? This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a transaction. She was being given away, traded off like a broken tool or a lame mule. No one was going to come looking for her. No one was going to send a search party. Her own stepmother hadn't even bothered to come outside to say goodbye. Her father had his back turned before the deal was even done. He didn't want to see her go. He just wanted her gone. The Apache, Chaser, didn't reach for her. He didn't grunt or bark a command. He just picked up his rope, then did something that made Clarara's breath catch in her throat. He unrolled a blanket from his satchel. It was worn and thin, but he held it out to her. He gestured toward his horse, his face still a stone mask. She hesitated, just for a second. She looked into his eyes, searching for the cruelty she expected to find. But there was nothing. No anger, no hunger, no ownership. He was just waiting. So she walked. She climbed onto the horse, sitting side saddle behind a bundle of supplies. The coarse hair of the animal pricked her legs through her thin dress. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't dare. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and rust, and their shadows stretched long and twisted behind them as they rode away from the only home she had ever known, a home that had never wanted her. She was riding into the unknown with a man no one would ever dare to follow. And as the last sliver of light vanished from the horizon, a terrifying thought crept into her mind. Maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. The cold came down like a hammer as soon as the sun was gone. The air bit at her exposed skin, sharp and unforgiving. Chaser finally stopped beside a dried-up creek bed. A dead cottonwood tree reached its skeletal branches toward the star-filled sky, like a ghost begging for mercy. He slid off the horse and began to unsaddle it with silent, efficient movements. He laid out a bedroll for himself, and then, with a piece of flint and a bit of patience, he coaxed a small fire to life. Still, he said nothing. Not a single word. Clara Ara sat a few feet away, huddled inside the blanket he'd given her. Her hands were numb, but she barely noticed. She was watching him. The firelight danced across his high cheekbones, as he skewered some strips of dried meat on a sharpened stick and held it over the flames. The smell of smoke and cooking meat hit her with a surprising force. It reminded her of things she hadn't let herself think about in years. Kitchen fires, warm bread on a Sunday morning, moments from a long-forgotten life that didn't hurt. Her stomach growled, loud and angry, but she clamped her jaw shut. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't ask. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. When the meat was cooked, Chaucer pulled the stick from the fire. He looked at the meager portion, then broke it in half without a second's hesitation. He held one piece out to her. She stared at it. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to show him she couldn't be bought with a piece of meat. But her body betrayed her. Her hand moved on its own, taking the offering. The meat was tough and smoky, but it was warm. It tasted like something made without cruelty, and that simple fact made it almost impossible to swallow past the lump in her throat. She watched him across the flickering flames. He didn't look like a monster. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He just looked tired. He looked like a man who had seen so much silence that he didn't need words anymore. There was no malice in him, no hidden agenda she could see. He just existed, quiet, sure, unshaken by the world around him, and she hated herself for the sharp pang of envy she felt. They didn't speak for the rest of the evening. They didn't need to. The silence had already said more than words ever could. Later that night, long after the fire had died down to glowing embers, Clara Ara was still wide awake. A sliver of a moon hung in the black sky, offering little light and no warmth at all. The blanket was pulled up to her chin, but the cold was relentless. It found its way into her bones. The ground was hard, and her back ached with a familiar, dull pain. But it wasn't the pain that was keeping her awake. It was confusion. It was a gnawing, unsettling feeling that churned in her gut. Why hadn't he done anything? He had paid for her. He had taken her. Why hadn't he taken what was his? Why hadn't he touched her, or demanded something from her, or treated her like the piece of property she was? She watched him from under her eyelashes. He was sitting at the edge of their small camp, his back to her. He was sharpening a long, wicked-looking blade. The soft, rhythmic scrape of stone against steel sent a shiver of fear down her spine. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, like a sliver of captured starlight. She didn't trust kindness, not from anyone. Kindness was a weapon, a tool used to lull you into a false sense of security before the real pain began. And this man's kindness was wrapped in a thick blanket of silence, which made it even more terrifying. Then he looked up. His head turned just slightly, and his eyes met hers in the darkness. She expected to see a threat, a demand, possession, but there was none of that. There was only recognition. It was the strangest feeling. It was as if he wasn't just looking at her. He was seeing her, the real her, the girl she kept buried deep inside, hidden under years of shame and ugliness. She looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. That night, she dreamed. She dreamed of water. Not the violent, churning water of a storm, but the calm, gentle surface of a still lake. She was floating, light as a feather, being carried along by a current she didn't have to fight. When she woke up, the sun was just beginning to touch the horizon. She still didn't know where they were going. She still didn't know what he wanted from her. But as she watched him pack up their camp with his usual quiet efficiency, she realized something profound. For the first time in her entire life, Clara Ara Whitlow wasn't being held, or dragged, or left behind. She was simply following, and she didn't know why, but that felt different. It felt like a choice. The desert light changed everything. By the second morning on the trail, the world had cracked wide open. The cramped, dusty world of her father's farm was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of rolling hills, dry brush, and strange rock formations that looked like they'd been carved by ancient giants. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue that stretched from one end of the earth to the other, making Clara Ara feel like a tiny speck in someone else's grand story. The horse moved with a slow, steady rhythm, a living metronome beneath her. Chaser walked ahead, leading the horse by the reins with one hand. His other arm was resting across his chest, and he moved with a strange kind of confidence, like he didn't even need to watch the trail to know where he was going. Clara Ara hadn't spoken a single word since they left, not one, and Chaser hadn't asked her to, but her silence felt different now. It wasn't a retreat anymore. It was a shield she was slowly realizing she might not need out here, not with him. Around midday, they stopped at a place where a tiny trickle of water had carved a path through the rock, gathering in a shallow, clear pool. Chaser let the horse drink, its long neck stretched out, its lips slurping greedily. Clara Ara slid off the horse's back and wandered a few steps away, kneeling beside the pool. She cupped the water in her hands and brought it to her face. It was shockingly cold, clean, real. She splashed her face again, then leaned over the water, her hair falling forward. And that's when she saw it, her reflection. It startled her so much she almost fell in. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was seeing herself without the filter of someone else's judgment. There was no sneer in the reflection, no whispered insults hanging in the air. It was just a girl with sun-bleached hair, cracked lips, and eyes that no longer looked terrified. They looked watchful. She didn't know what to do with the face staring back at her. She heard a soft rustling behind her and turned to see Chaser gathering something from a patch of brush. He was carefully plucking small white flowers and leaves, which gave off a faint lemony scent when he crushed them gently in his hand. He placed the bundle of herbs into a small cloth pouch, tied it closed with a piece of sinew, and then he did something that completely floored her. He handed it to her. She just blinked, staring at the small, simple pouch in his hand. "What's this?" she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. Chaser didn't speak. He just tapped his own temple with his finger, then made a gesture as if he were sleeping. "For dreams?" she guessed, her voice barely audible. He nodded once, a single sharp nod. She took the pouch from him. It was warm from his hand. The cloth was simple, stitched with dark thread and worn at the corners. It was nothing special, but it was the first gift she had received in years that hadn't come with a price tag attached. It wasn't a trade. It wasn't a payment. It was just a gift. She clutched it tightly in her hand, the small bundle a solid, real thing in her palm. She looked up at him and nodded back. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt strange and foreign on her tongue. He didn't smile, but she saw something in his shoulders relax, a tiny release of tension that was more expressive than any smile could have been. That night, they camped under a small stand of cedar trees. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the smell of sap and dust. Chaser built the fire with his usual quiet competence, while Clara Ara, for the first time, helped. She spread the blankets, smoothing them out, making a space for them in the wilderness. The silence between them had changed again. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of unspoken questions, and maybe, just maybe, the beginnings of unspoken answers. After they ate, she pulled the small pouch of herbs from her skirt pocket. She turned it over and over in her hands, the rough texture of the cloth a comfort against her skin. "My mother used to keep herbs," she said aloud, the sound of her own voice surprising her. "Chamomile, mostly. She said it made the night softer. She died when I was 10. She didn't know why she said it. The words just came out, tumbling into the space between them. Chaser looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. He was still and silent, but she knew he was listening. "She had a soft voice," Clara Ara went on, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "She didn't shout like the others. She used to hum when she brushed my hair. After she passed, nobody brushed it again." She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. She felt foolish, weak. She had just cracked open her chest and let one of her most painful truths crawl out into the firelight, But when she dared to look at Chaser, he wasn't looking at her with pity. He wasn't looking at her like she was weak. He wasn't even looking away in discomfort. He was just looking at her. And then he nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that felt like he was acknowledging something sacred. "I don't know why you took me," she added, the words a quiet breath of smoke. "My father, he would have given me to you for nothing." He looked at the fire for a long, long moment. The flames painted shifting patterns of light and shadow on his face. Then he lifted his eyes to hers. He raised one hand, his fingers long and calloused. He pointed, very gently, first to his own chest, then to hers. "I don't understand," she whispered, her heart starting to beat a little faster. He made the gesture again, then drew a slow, careful line across his heart. It wasn't a gesture of ownership. It was a gesture of connection. You saw something?" she asked, her voice trembling. "In me?" He held her gaze for a beat longer. Then he nodded once. That night, as she lay beneath a sky so full of stars, it looked like a spill of diamond dust, Clara Ara turned onto her side and closed her eyes. She held the small pouch of herbs against her chest. The scent of lemon and wildflower rose up to meet her, a soft, gentle perfume in the cold night air. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't fight sleep. She welcomed it. She let it pull her under, into a place where the dreams were soft and warm, and for once, she wasn't alone in the dark. The trail began to climb the next day, leading them into a winding canyon of red rock. The horse strained against the steep incline, its breath coming in ragged puffs. Chaser paused more often now, letting the animal rest, his hand resting on its neck in a gesture of quiet reassurance. At one point he stopped and knelt beside a cluster of stones, his eyes scanning the dusty ground. He looked up and gestured for Clara Ara to come closer. She slid off the horse and walked carefully toward him, her worn boots crunching on the loose gravel. He pointed to a small track in the dust. It was a delicate set of prints, with 2 long toes and a narrow heel. "Deer?" she guessed, her voice soft. Chaser shook his head. He held up 2 fingers, close together, to show her how small it was. Then, he mimicked a quick hopping motion with his hand. A small smile touched Clarara's lips. "Rabbit," she said. He nodded, and for a fleeting second she saw something flicker in his eyes. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. He then picked up a smooth, flat rock from the ground. It was shaped almost like an arrowhead, but its edges were worn smooth by water and time. It was more like a worry stone, something to be held and turned over in your fingers. He handed it to her. She took it, its coolness a surprise against her warm skin. She ran her thumb over its smooth, polished surface. "You keep giving me things," she said, her voice filled with a genuine confusion. "Why?" He just shrugged, but then it happened. The corner of his mouth lifted just barely, but it was there. A real, actual smile. It transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making him look younger, less burdened. That night the fire seemed warmer. Clara Ara sat with her knees drawn up to her chest, the smooth stone he'd given her clutched in her hand. She watched the flames dance and flicker, their light casting long, moving shadows on the canyon walls. She still hadn't asked where they were going. She was starting to think it didn't matter anymore. Out here in the vast, silent wilderness, the world was honest. It didn't pretend to be fair, but it didn't lie to you either. She glanced across the fire at Chaser. He was sharpening a tool, his movements slow, careful, and deliberate. Each stroke of the stone was filled with purpose. "You're not what I expected," she said, the words coming out before she had time to think about them. He looked up, his hands stilling. "Everyone said, well, they said Apache were—" She trailed off, uncertain how to finish the sentence without insulting him. "They said things, none of them kind." Chaser met her eyes without flinching. His gaze was steady, unwavering. He waited. Then, in a voice that was quiet and rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. He spoke his first words to her. People lie. The two words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. Clara just stared at him, her mouth slightly open. You speak English? He nodded once. Enough. Why? She breathed, the question a whisper. Why didn't you say anything before? He looked away from her, his gaze returning to the fire. He seemed to be considering his answer carefully. Silence, he said, his voice still low and raspy. Tells truth faster. A breath she didn't even know she'd been holding escaped her lungs in a long, slow sigh. And then she did something she hadn't done in years. She smiled. A real smile. It was small and tired, but it was genuine. It reached her eyes and made them sparkle in the firelight. And across the fire, for the second time that day, he smiled back. This time, it wasn't just a flicker. It was a real, full smile that transformed his face and reached all the way to his dark, quiet eyes. That night, when she laid down to sleep, the world felt different. The fear was still there, a faint echo in the back of her mind, but it had thinned. The ache in her heart hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled her. Somewhere in the quiet rhythm of their journey, between the shared meals and the silent understandings, between one sunrise and the next, Clara Whitlow had started to feel something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Safe. The third week on the trail brought a new kind of hardship. The gentle spring chill had vanished, replaced by a sun that was mean and relentless. It beat down on them, baking the earth and sucking the moisture from the air. A fine layer of dust coated everything. It was in their clothes, in their hair, and behind Clara's ears. Her muscles screamed in protest from the long days of riding and walking. Her hands were stiff and sore from gripping the reins and gathering firewood. But she hadn't complained, not once. And for reasons she hadn't yet dared to admit to herself, she didn't want to. They weren't strangers anymore. They weren't quite friends either. They were something else. Something new and fragile that was being built between them, like a thin, silken thread stretching across the deep ravine of their separate loneliness. It happened late one afternoon, just as the sky was beginning to melt into shades of orange and purple. Clara had wandered off the trail to collect dry branches for the fire. The path had dipped into a shallow ravine, scattered with loose rocks and thorny creosote bushes. Her arms were full of sticks, and her skirt was catching on the burrs when it happened. Her boot slid on a patch of loose gravel. She stumbled hard, crying out as she went down, landing with all her weight on one knee. The bundle of sticks scattered around her. A sharp, immediate pain bloomed in her leg. "Damn it," she hissed, pressing a hand to her throbbing knee. Before she could even try to stand, she heard his voice. It was low and urgent. Clara. He was beside her in seconds, his face a mask of concern. He knelt in the dust, his eyes scanning her face, then her leg. His hands were careful and gentle as he pulled the hem of her skirt back just enough to see the angry, swelling bruise that was already forming below her kneecap. He looked at her then, his eyes asking a question. She gave a small, shaky nod. He touched her leg gently, his fingers probing the area around the bone, testing for a break. She winced, but his touch was surprisingly light. There was no fracture, just the kind of deep, painful bruise that would leave her limping for days. "It's not broken," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, his expression unreadable, and then, before she could protest, he scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He started carrying her back to camp, his stride long and sure. Clara blinked, stunned by the suddenness of it all. "You don't have to," she started to say, but he cut her off. He didn't speak. He just kept walking, his jaw set, his grip solid and unwavering. She didn't argue again. She just rested her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his cloak scratching her cheek, and let him carry her. Back at camp, he gently set her down on a bedroll. He went to his supply sack and began mixing a paste of crushed leaves and cool water. The sharp, clean scent of wild mint filled the air. He applied the poultice to her bruised knee with slow, gentle movements, his touch incredibly soft. He then tore a strip of cloth from his own supply sack and wrapped it carefully around her leg. She watched him, her throat tight with a strange mix of emotions. She was stunned by his care, by the way his silence made room for her pain instead of dismissing it. "I haven't been carried since I was 6, she murmured, the words barely a whisper. He looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting hers. "My mother did it," she continued, her voice soft. "When I got a fever, she sat on the porch with me and sang until I stopped shaking." Chaser didn't speak, but his hand lingered on the bandage for just a second longer than it needed to. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Later that evening, her leg was propped up on a saddlebag, and the fire warmed the space between them. Clara Ara found herself talking again, the words spilling out of her like water from a cracked dam. "I used to think I'd marry a storekeeper," she said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Or maybe a man with a small ranch. Nothing big. Just someone who wouldn't yell. Someone who didn't mind that I wasn't—" She paused, unable to say the word. "Pretty." Chaser's eyes lifted from the fire, his gaze intense. "I know what people think when they look at me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm not soft. I'm not sweet. I'm not the kind of woman a man wants to show off at the Sunday gathering." He said nothing. He just reached into the satchel beside him and pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of soft cloth. Slowly, carefully, he unwrapped it and placed it in her palm. It was a hairpin. It was long and narrow, carved from bone. Delicate, tribal markings were etched into its surface, worn smooth by time and touch. The tip curled into a graceful spiral, and the entire piece had a soft, polished sheen. It was beautiful. It was ancient. Clara Ara stared at it, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings. "What is this?" "It belonged to my mother," Chaser said, his voice soft. "She made it for her daughter-in-law, the wife of her son." He paused. "She never got to meet her." Clarara's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the hairpin, then back at him. "You don't have to give me this." "I do," he said simply. "Why?" she whispered, her throat tight. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the fire for a long moment. Then he looked back at her, his eyes full of a strange, fierce light. "Because," he said, his voice low and steady, "you haven't asked for anything, and still, you give." She blinked, a hot tear threatening to spill down her cheek. "I'm not your wife," she said quietly. "No," he said, his voice softer now. "But you are not what was thrown away either." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. A thick, meaningful silence settled between them. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of things that couldn't be said, things that could only be felt. Clara ran her thumb over the smooth surface of the hairpin, its weight a solid grounding presence in her hand. She carefully wrapped it back in its cloth and tucked it safely into her travel bag. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Her leg throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But that wasn't what was keeping her awake. It was something else. Something had begun to shift inside her, a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of her soul. She had spent years building a fortress around her heart, a barricade of shame and silence. But this man, this quiet, gentle stranger, had somehow found a way through. He hadn't just endured her. He hadn't just tolerated her. He had seen her, and in his quiet, solid way, he had chosen to share his fire, his food, and now, a precious relic from his family. She didn't know what to do with that kind of kindness. She only knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that she wanted to be worthy of it. By morning, her leg was stiff, but she could put weight on it. Chaser had carved a walking stick for her from a sturdy mesquite branch. She leaned on it as they broke camp, the rough bark a comfort against her palm. The pain wasn't bad enough to stop her from walking beside the horse instead of riding. She liked it better that way. It felt like they were equals. As they climbed a steep slope that overlooked the vast desert basin, she turned to him. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice calm and steady. Chaser gazed out at the distant horizon, a faint line where the earth met the sky. "To my village," he said. She blinked. "You're home?" He nodded. "They'll be waiting for you." A jolt went through Clara Ara, but it wasn't fear. It was something heavier, something more complex. It was hope, a tiny, fragile seed of hope that she hadn't dared to feel in years. She didn't know what was waiting for her in his village. Curiosity, suspicion, rejection. She didn't know. But for the first time, she didn't flinch from the thought. Because wherever they were going there together. The village appeared suddenly, as if rising from the earth itself. It was nestled in a shallow valley, protected on all sides by towering red cliffs and hills covered in scrub brush. From a distance, it looked serene. Rounded huts made of wood and animal hide were clustered together, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled lazily from a central fire pit. A few children, their skin the color of rich earth, ran barefoot in the dust, their laughter echoing in the clear air. It should have felt like a homecoming. But as they drew closer, a knot of ice formed in Clara Ara's stomach. She saw the change in Chaser's posture. He sat up straighter in the saddle, his relaxed demeanor gone. His expression, usually so calm and still, had hardened into a stone mask. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to. She could feel it too. A quiet tension in the air, a silent warning carried on the wind. As they rode into the village, the world seemed to slow down. Eyes turned toward them. First the children, their games stopping abruptly. Then the women who were drawing water from a well, their hands freezing in mid-motion. Then the elders, sitting in the shade of a large central lodge, their conversations dying on their lips. Every single face sharpened when they saw Clara. It was like a physical blow. A woman holding a heavy clay pot froze, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and suspicion. Water sloshed over the edge of the pot, unnoticed. Her gaze locked onto Clara, and it was not a welcoming one. Clara kept her chin up, but her stomach was churning with a sick, familiar dread. She wasn't a fool. She knew how she looked to them. A pale-skinned stranger, her clothes worn and dusty, her hair a tangled mess. An outsider. And worse, she was arriving not as a guest, but beside one of their own. Chaser hadn't brought her here to trade. He hadn't brought her for shelter. He had brought her as something else. Something unspoken. Something dangerous. They dismounted near the central fire pit. The entire village seemed to be holding its breath. Chaser gave a low whistle, and a lean, older man stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair and a long, jagged scar that ran down one cheek. His eyes were sharp, not cruel, but hard as flint. He and Chaser spoke in their own language, a torrent of low, guttural words that Clara couldn't understand. The elder's voice was firm, questioning. Chaser's answers were short, his tone calm but resolute. The tense exchange ended with the elder glancing at Clara, a look of grudging acceptance on his face. He gave a single, sharp nod, and Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Chaser led her to a small shelter at the edge of the village. It was simple, but clean. A raised sleeping mat covered in soft furs, a clay basin for washing, and 2 neatly folded woven blankets near the wall. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice quiet. Clara ran her fingers along the edge of the soft fur. "She's gone?" He nodded. "Many winters ago." He didn't say more. He left her there to rest, promising to return after he had spoken with the village council. Clara sat alone for what felt like an eternity, watching the sunlight shift through the open doorway. She listened to the sounds of the village, the clop of hooves, the clinking of pots, the sharp bursts of children's laughter. But underneath it all, she could feel a current of unease she couldn't shake. She wasn't welcome here. Not really. She was an intrusion, a disruption to their world. That evening, Chaser returned. He brought a bowl of thick, savory stew and a small loaf of hard, flat bread. She ate in silence, her appetite gone. She was grateful for the food, but her mind was racing. "You didn't tell them I was your wife," she said, stating a fact, not asking a question. "No," he answered, his gaze steady, "because I'm not." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Because I did not want to lie." She nodded, but a strange, hollow feeling bloomed in her chest. "Will they accept me?" He looked her full in the face then, his eyes dark and serious. "Some will never." "And you?" she whispered. His voice was quiet, but it was as solid as the rock of the cliffs surrounding them. "I already have." The days that followed were a trial by fire. Clara Ara did everything she could to earn her place, to prove she wasn't a threat. She worked from sunup to sundown. She helped the women grind cornmeal until her shoulders ached. She hauled heavy buckets of water from the well. She learned how to stitch repairs into tough leather, her fingers clumsy at first, but slowly becoming more skilled. She listened carefully when an older woman, whose eyes were softer than the others, showed her how to brew a bitter medicinal tea from wild roots. But the eyes still followed her everywhere she went. A constant, silent judgment. She was never invited to join the women when they gathered around the evening fire to talk and laugh. Children, who would normally be curious about a stranger, were quickly pulled away by their mothers if they wandered too close to her. One afternoon, as she was setting a basket of dried beans near the communal cooking fire, a young woman with braids as long and black as a raven's wing stepped directly in front of her. The woman's face was twisted in a sneer of contempt. She looked Clara Ara up and down, then spat on the ground at her feet. She hissed something sharp in her own language, her voice like the crack of a whip. Clara Ara froze, her heart pounding. She didn't understand the words, but the meaning was as clear as a knife to the gut. "You don't belong here. You are nothing." That night, Chaser found her sitting outside their small shelter, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring out into the darkness. "I tried," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I really tried." "I know," he said, his voice a low rumble. He knelt beside her in the dust. "I keep thinking, if I just work harder or smile more or just disappear." "You do not have to change," he said, his voice firm. "They hate me," she said, the words a painful admission. "Some of them," he corrected gently, "hate the idea of you, not you." Clara Ara just shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "What's the difference?" Chaser didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved stone pendant. It was shaped like a mountain cat, poised to strike, its muscles coiled and powerful. He placed it in her hand. The stone was cool and smooth against her skin. "My sister carved this," he said softly. "For strength." Clara stared at the pendant, then looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "I don't want to stay here, Chaser. I don't want to live where I'm just tolerated." A long silence stretched between them. Then he said, "You do not have to." She blinked, confused. "What are you saying?" "There is land," he said, his gaze fixed on the distant moonlit cliffs. "Near the Red Ridge. It is quiet. Water runs through it in the spring. We can build there, a new place." Her breath caught in her throat. "Leave? Leave the village?" He nodded. "You came from silence. I did too. Maybe what we need is a place that remembers none of it." Clara Ara clutched the stone pendant so tightly that its sharp edges dug into her palm. The small pain was grounding. "I don't want to be something you pity," she whispered. "Another broken thing you have to fix." Chaser looked at her then, and his eyes were not soft. They were filled with a fierce, burning intensity. "I do not pity you, Clara Ara," he said, his voice low and powerful. "I choose you." They left before the sun came up. There were no farewells, no explanations, just two silent figures on horseback, riding out of the valley and away from the judgment of the village. They were riding toward a piece of land that held no memories, good or bad, a place where perhaps something new and whole could finally begin. The new land was a revelation. It was quiet, wild, and achingly beautiful. A small, clear creek cut a winding path along the edge of a series of low, rolling hills. Cottonwood and willow trees grew in thick clusters along its banks, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. The grass was long and green, swaying in the wind like a golden green ocean. It looked like a place where nothing had ever gone wrong. Clara slid off the horse's back, her boots sinking into the soft earth. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing. The air was clean and sweet, filled with the scent of damp earth and wild blossoms. Chaser began unloading their meager supplies without a word. A few clay pots, their blankets, a worn hatchet, and a small, sharp saw. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, as if building a life from scratch was the most natural thing in the world. They started with a temporary shelter, a simple lean-to made from the branches of a fallen tree and the broad, tanned hide they'd carried with them from the village. While Chaser worked on the structure, Clara dug out a shallow ring for their fire, lining it with stones she gathered from the creek bed. By nightfall, they had everything they needed: warmth, food, shelter, and something they hadn't realized how much they craved: space. Space to breathe, space to think, space to simply be. The days that followed blurred into a peaceful routine of quiet, shared work. Clara discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed. She learned how to stretch a wet hide until it was taut and waterproof, creating a durable roof for their small home. She learned the best times of day to catch the small, silvery fish that darted in the creek. She learned to distinguish the harmless snake grass from the sweet, edible roots that grew in the shade of the willow trees. Chaser was a patient teacher. He showed her how to use soft moss to line the inside of her worn boots when the soles began to wear thin. He taught her how to mix red clay and sand to create a sturdy, heat-resistant cooking pit. Together, piece by piece, they shaped a home. It was humble. It was makeshift. But it was theirs. And slowly, so slowly she barely noticed it happening, the silence between them changed again. It was no longer a space to be filled, but a comfortable blanket they shared. They spoke more now. Little things, practical things. The wood is damp. There are deer tracks by the ridge. The words were calm, simple, but they were never wasted. Each one held weight and intention. One night, as the fire crackled and a billion stars blazed in the vast black sky, Clara was twisting her long hair up off her neck to escape the heat of the flames. Chaser reached over without a word and gently handed her the bone hairpin he'd given her weeks before. She blinked, surprised. "I thought I lost it," she said, the familiar feel of the smooth, carved bone a comfort in her hand. "It was in your travel bag," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Wrapped in cloth, like something sacred." She looked at him, her heart giving a little flutter. "It is," she said quietly. The next morning, everything changed. A sound, distant and panicked, shattered the peaceful silence of their valley. It was the frantic cry of a horse, followed by the faint, desperate shout of a woman. Chaser froze, his hand tightening on the edge of the hide he was stretching. Clara stood up from her spot by the creek, water dripping from her fingertips. The sound came again, closer this time. A woman's voice, raw with fear and pain. Without a moment's hesitation, Chaser grabbed the knife from his belt and sprinted toward the sound. Clara was right behind him. They found her slumped beside the splintered remains of a broken wagon wheel, half hidden in a tangle of dusty sagebrush. Her dress was torn. Her hands were raw and bloody from clawing at the unforgiving earth. She looked up as they approached, her eyes wide with terror. "Please," she rasped, her voice cracking. "Help me." Clara Ara knelt beside her, pulling her water skin from her belt. "Are you hurt?" My horse bolted," the woman stammered, her body trembling. "The wheel, it just snapped. I fell." Her voice was ragged, her face pale beneath a layer of grime. Her cheekbone was swollen and bruised, and there was a gash on her temple where dried blood had matted her hair. Clara Ara glanced at Chaser, who was already scanning the surrounding horizon, his eyes missing nothing. "Was anyone with you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "No," the woman said, flinching as she tried to sit up. "Just me. I was trying to get to Fort Duncan. My name is Martha Garrison." Clara Ara offered her the water skin. "You're lucky we heard you." Martha's eyes flicked from Clara Ara to Chaser, and her lips thinned into a hard, tight line. "He's Apache." Clara Ara felt a surge of anger. "Yes," she said, her voice sharp. "And he just saved your life." Martha said nothing, but her silence was loud. They brought her back to their camp. They laid her down on a soft bed of furs beneath the lean-to and gently cleaned her wounds. Martha allowed Clara Ara to tend to her, wincing in pain as the cool water touched her cuts, but she refused to look Chaser in the eye. That night, they shared a meal of roasted rabbit and boiled roots. Martha sat stiffly beside the fire, her body turned slightly away from Chaser, as if creating an invisible wall between them. "Thank you," she said eventually, but her words were aimed only at Clara Ara. Chaser said nothing. He didn't seem offended by her blatant rudeness. He simply stood up, melted into the shadows beyond the firelight, and went to check the snares he'd set earlier. "He's not like the stories," Clara Ara said quietly, once they were alone. Martha wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I didn't say he was." "You didn't have to," Clara Ara retorted. A long, tense silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rustle of the wind through the tall grass. "I lost my brother in a raid," Martha said suddenly, her voice low and brittle. "He was only 16. They took him. We never found the body." Clara said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I don't hate your man," Martha continued, stumbling over the word. I don't forget." Clara stared into the flames, her own memories swirling in the smoke. Memories of a cold father, a dismissive family, a world that had told her she was worthless. "Neither do I," she said softly, "but I choose what I remember." The next morning, Chaser was standing near the horse when Clara Ara approached him. "She wants to go to the fort," Clara Ara said. "She asked if we could take her, at least part of the way." He nodded once, his expression unreadable. "We will leave before midday. Are you sure?" He met her gaze, his eyes dark and serious. "She is still a person, wounded." Clara Ara placed a hand on his arm, a gesture that felt both new and incredibly natural. "You're a better man than most." "No," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just not tired enough to stop trying." As they packed their meager belongings, Clara Ara glanced at the small home they had built together. The sturdy lean-to, the neat drying rack, the stone-lined fire pit. They would have to leave it behind, at least for now. They could come back. But a part of her, a small, cold knot of dread in her stomach, knew that this next leg of their journey would change everything. Martha wasn't just a stranger they had rescued. She was a voice from the world they had tried so hard to escape. A world that believed in lines. Lines drawn by blood, by skin color, by fear and memory. And they were about to walk right back into it. They traveled northeast, heading toward the distant promise of Fort Duncan. The air grew thick with the familiar sense of dust and old, bitter memories. The rolling hills flattened into an open plain, the brush thinning out, leaving them exposed under the vast, empty sky. Clara Ara rode beside Martha, who sat stiffly in the saddle, one hand still pressed protectively to her bandaged side. Chaser rode ahead, a silent, watchful sentinel, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The silence of the first day was heavy, suffocating. Words felt like dangerous strangers, best left alone. It wasn't until they stopped for water at a muddy, slow-moving creek that Martha finally spoke. "You two, married?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp and probing. Clara shook her head, not looking at her. "No." Martha raised a skeptical eyebrow. "But you live together. Out there. Just the two of you." Clara's jaw tensed. She dipped her hands in the cool water, splashing her face. "We chose each other," she said, her voice tight. "That's enough." Martha didn't argue, but her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. "Not sure the world would agree with you on that." "I'm not sure I care what the world thinks," Clara snapped back, her patience wearing thin. Martha looked away, her gaze drifting across the empty plain. "Then you've never had to walk back into it after you've crossed a line." The words stung, sharp and true, but Clara refused to let her see the hurt. She said nothing. By early afternoon, a small cluster of weathered wooden buildings appeared on the horizon. A trading post, a rusted sign, hanging crookedly from one hinge, creaked in the wind, McLaren's goods and provisions. A few dusty wagons were parked near the stables. A man in stained suspenders and a sweat-ringed straw hat leaned against the porch railing, chewing on a toothpick. His eyes narrowed into suspicious slits as they approached. Martha dismounted first, her movements stiff and pained. "I'll go inside," she said, avoiding Chaser's gaze. "Get a message to the fort. They'll send someone for me." Clara nodded. "We'll wait." But as Martha stepped onto the porch, she turned and looked back. Not at Clara. She looked directly at Chaser, her expression a mixture of fear and warning. "You might want to stay out of sight," she said, her voice low. "People around here, they don't take kindly to—" Clara stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. "We'll be fine," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. Martha stared at her for a beat longer, then turned and disappeared through the creaking door of the trading post. They waited in the sliver of shade behind the stables. Chaser, ever practical, began quietly repairing a broken strap on one of their packs. Clara paced back and forth, a restless energy thrumming through her. "She's afraid," she said, more to herself than to him. Chaser nodded, his eyes focused on his work. "She is also dangerous." Another nod. Clara stopped her pacing and sat down beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you regret it? Helping her?" "No." "She's going to talk, though," Clara said, voicing the fear that was churning in her gut. "About us. About you." Chaser didn't respond right away. He finished tying a knot, testing it with a firm tug. Then he looked at her. "Let her." Clara studied his face, the calm lines etched around his eyes, the steady set of his jaw. "You're not worried." "I have been hunted before," he said simply. "It does not change who I am." She let out a long, slow breath. "I'm not afraid of dying," she confessed, her voice a whisper. "I'm afraid of being erased. Of us, not mattering, because we don't fit into someone else's story." He looked at her then, really looked at her, his dark eyes full of a fierce, unwavering strength. "They do not get to write it," he said. An hour dragged by, then 2. Finally, Martha emerged from the trading post. But she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her was a man in a dusty blue uniform, a rifle strapped across his shoulder. He was young, with red, sunburnt cheeks, and a posture as stiff and unbending as a fence post. His hand rested on the butt of his rifle, a casual gesture that was anything but. Martha pointed in their direction. The soldier's eyes followed her finger, and he began walking toward them, his boots crunching in the dirt. Clara got to her feet. Chaser rose slowly, his movements fluid and unhurried. "Ma'am," the soldier said, his eyes fixed on Clara, completely ignoring Chaser as if he were invisible. "You traveling with this man?" "I am," Clara said, her voice steady. "Are you safe, ma'am?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "Safer than I ever was in town." The soldier cleared his throat, his cheeks turning an even deeper shade of red. "You're aware, ma'am, that there's tension with some of the Apache bands. There have been rumors of raids. Folks are on edge." Chaser said nothing. He just stood there, as still and unreadable as a stone monument. "He's not part of that," Clara Ara said firmly. The soldier glanced at Martha, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He looked back at Clara Ara. "Even so," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "for your own protection, I'd recommend you separate." "No, ma'am," Clara Ara said, her voice dropping, laced with ice. "I said no." The soldier's hand twitched, his fingers tightening on his rifle. Chaser shifted his weight slightly. It wasn't an aggressive move, but it was enough. A silent reminder that he was not afraid, that he was not to be underestimated. A tense, dangerous silence stretched between them, as taut as a drawn bowstring. And then another voice cut through the air. It was a woman's voice, calm, measured, and filled with an undeniable authority. "That is enough." Everyone turned. A tall woman stood at the edge of the post road, her figure silhouetted against the harsh afternoon sun. She was dressed in soft deerskin, and her long braids were streaked with gray. Her eyes were as sharp and black as chips of obsidian. She carried herself with a quiet power that was more commanding than any uniform or rifle. The young soldier, who had been so full of bluster just a moment before, immediately took a step back, his bravado vanishing like smoke. "Taver," Chaser said, his voice filled with a quiet surprise. Clara Ara looked from Chaser to the woman, confused. "You know her?" "My cousin," he said, "a peacekeeper among the southern Apache." Tever stepped forward, her moccasins making no sound on the dusty ground. She nodded once to Chaser, a gesture of deep respect. Then she turned her piercing gaze on Clara Ara. "I came because I heard what happened in the village," she said, her voice calm and strong. "Some thought you betrayed us by leaving. Others saw the truth." "What truth?" Clara Ara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Tever's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "That you were not running away," she said. "You were protecting something new." Chaser said nothing, but Clara Ara felt his fingers brush against hers, a brief, reassuring touch. Tever then turned her attention to the flustered soldier. "This man is no threat," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "He is known to our council. You will not touch him." The young soldier hesitated, then his hand dropped from his rifle. "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled. Martha, who had been watching the scene unfold with a frown on her face, finally spoke up. "So that's it? He just gets to walk away?" Tever's sharp eyes settled on her. "You walked away from something too, did you not?" Martha stiffened, her face flushing with anger, but she said no more. That night, they didn't ride back to their peaceful valley. They rode east, following Tever toward the higher ground. She knew of a place, she said, a sheltered canyon where there was water, a place where people of peace sometimes went to heal. "You are not alone out here," Tever said, her voice a quiet comfort in the growing darkness. "Not if you keep walking in truth." Chaser nodded, his face illuminated by the rising moon. Clara Ara gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles white. The world hadn't changed. The hate, the fear, the prejudice, it was all still out there. But now, for the first time, someone had stood for them, and that meant they weren't entirely invisible anymore. The canyon was a secret paradise, a place tucked away from the harshness of the world. It was a deep, winding scar in the earth, its red rock walls softened by centuries of wind and rain. A small, clear stream snaked along the canyon floor, its surface glinting like silver in the moonlight. Cottonwood trees, their leaves whispering in the night breeze, leaned over the water as if sharing secrets. The air smelled clean and sweet, a mixture of sage and damp stone. It was a quiet place, but it was the quiet of sanctuary, not the dead quiet of fear. Chaser dismounted first, his movements graceful and sure. He turned and reached up to help Clara Ara down from the horse. Her legs ached from the long, tense ride, but she didn't make a sound. She was done with complaining. She was done with being weak. He caught her easily, his hands warm and steady around her waist. He held her for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze searching hers in the dim light. Neither of them moved. Tever watched them from a short distance, her arms crossed over her chest. A faint, knowing smile played on her lips. "I will not stay long," she said, her voice soft. "But I had to see for myself." Clara Ara finally stepped back, brushing a stray piece of hair from her face. "See what?" Tever tilted her head, her sharp eyes twinkling. "That the man I grew up with had not turned bitter, and that the girl he chose had not broken." A small, almost imperceptible relaxation eased the tension in Chazer's shoulders. Clara Ara met Tever's gaze, a silent challenge in her eyes. "You think this is foolish, don't you?" "I think it is hard," Tever corrected gently. "But not wrong." They sat together by the fire that night, the three of them forming a small circle of warmth against the vast darkness. Chazer sharpened his tools with his usual focused intensity. Clara Ara stirred a small pot of lentils, watching as they bubbled over the flames. Tever sat quietly, her nimble fingers braiding and unbraiding a strip of soft rawhide. "I left the tribe once," Tever said suddenly, her voice pulling Clara Ara from her thoughts. "Not like you did, Chazer, but not far off. There was a time when speaking for peace made me look like a traitor, especially when the raids started, especially when the blood was hot." "What did you do?" Clara Ara asked, her voice a whisper. "I waited," Tever said, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I listened, and I stayed alive long enough for others to remember that I was right." The words settled in the air between them, as heavy and warm as the coals beneath the stew pot. After a long, comfortable silence, Chazer finally spoke. "Do they still hate me?" Tever met his eyes, her expression serious. "Some do," she admitted, "but others have begun to ask why you left, instead of fighting. That is a start." Clara Ara stirred the lentils slowly, thoughtfully. "And if we came back?" Tever hesitated, her fingers stilling on the rawhide braid. "Not now," she said, "but maybe in time." The next morning, Chazer and Clara Ara began setting up a more permanent camp. They built a raised platform for sleeping to keep them off the cold, damp ground. They laid out a ring of stones to mark the edges of a small garden plot. They even started building a small pen, in case they could trade for goats or chickens at a friendly settlement down the line. Tever helped them at first. She showed Clara Ara how to strip the supple branches of a willow tree into strong cordage. She taught her how to lay fragrant cedar boughs beneath their blankets for warmth and to keep the insects away. "Will you stay?" Clara Ara asked as they worked together, hauling heavy stones for a new, more permanent fire circle. Tever shook her head, a look of regret in her eyes. "I cannot. I am needed elsewhere. There is still peace to be kept, and not many of us left to keep it." Clara Ara nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. "I will come back," Tever added, placing a reassuring hand on Clara Ara's arm. "Not to check on you, just to sit in your silence, maybe braid some leather, maybe say nothing at all." A small, tired smile touched Clara Ara's lips. That would be nice. That night, after Tever had mounted her horse and ridden off into the dusky twilight, Clara Ara found Chazer staring into the fire, the small, carved mountain cat pendant held loosely in his hand. He didn't say anything as she came and sat beside him. She was tired, so tired, but it was a good kind of tired, the weariness that comes from hard, honest work. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time he reached up and gently combed his fingers through her hair, his touch slow and careful. "I don't miss the village," Clara Ara said softly. "I know," he rumbled, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "But sometimes," she confessed, "I miss the idea of being part of something." He turned his head, his lips brushing against her hair. "You are," he said, "here." 2 days passed in peaceful, productive quiet. On the third morning, Clara Ara went down to the stream to gather water for their breakfast. She paused by the flat, sun-warmed stones where the creek bent to the east, watching the tiny, silvery minnows dart and flash in the shallow water. The sunlight painted the rocks a brilliant gold. She thought of the village, of the hostile faces and the cold, judgmental eyes. She thought of how they had looked right through her, as if she were made of smoke. And then she thought of this place, this quiet canyon, this man. And for the first time, she felt rooted. She felt like she belonged. She bent down to rinse her hands in the cool, clear water. She caught her reflection, and once again, she was startled by the change. Her face wasn't softer, but it was fuller. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out. The bruises of shame that had haunted her expression for so long had finally faded. The weariness was still there, etched in the fine lines around her eyes, but it no longer defined her. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her. They were light but fast and urgent. She turned, her heart lurching in her chest. Chazer was already moving down the slope toward her, his eyes sharp and alert, his hand already on the hilt of the knife at his side. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with alarm. She didn't have to wait for an answer. A sound, low and pained, cut through the peaceful morning air. It was a voice, distant but clear, calling Chazer's name. Clara Ara's blood ran cold. A man stumbled into view from the thicket of trees at the edge of the canyon. He was clutching his side, his clothes torn and stained with dark, wet blood. His hair was long and matted with dust and leaves. He took a few staggering steps, then his legs gave out. Clara Ara froze, paralyzed by shock. But Chazer rushed forward, his movements swift and sure, catching the man just before he collapsed to the ground. "Ada!" Chazer breathed, his voice filled with a stunned disbelief. Clara Ara forced her legs to move. She stepped closer, her eyes wide with confusion. "Who is he?" Chazer looked up at her, his face a mask of turmoil. "My father." He eased the wounded man down beside the stream, calling for water. Clara knelt beside them, her hands trembling as she pressed the clean cloth from her satchel against the deep, bleeding wound in Ida's ribs. The wound was bad, but she didn't think it was fatal. Ida coughed, a racking, painful sound. His eyes fluttered open. "They're coming!" he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Wissa, he has turned the council against you. He told them, the white woman. She bewitched you." Clara Ara's hands trembled violently now. The cloth was already soaked with blood. "They will bring the cavalry," Ida rasped, his eyes pleading with his son. "They will say she was kidnapped, that you are the traitor. He means to force a war, to take the land. For good." Chazer's face darkened into a thunderous scowl. "When?" "Soon," Ida whispered, his eyes closing again. I barely escaped." Clara Ara looked from the wounded father to the son, the terrible truth crashing down on her like a physical blow. "They're using me," she said, her voice shaking. "They're using me to start a war." Chazer nodded, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Unless we stop them." The fire popped behind them, but the air in the canyon had gone deathly cold. For the first time since they had left the village, Clara Ara felt the full weight of the world pressing in on her again. The fear, the hatred, the violence. It had followed them. It had found them. And yet, she didn't flinch. She looked from Chazer's grim face to his father's pale one, and a cold, hard resolve settled in her heart. "Then we don't run," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We stop it." Chazer met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a reflection of her own fierce determination. "Yes," he said, "together." They didn't know how. They didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. The time for hiding was over. They moved before the first light of dawn touched the canyon walls. Chazer, his hands surprisingly gentle, loaded his wounded father onto the horse. He had bound Ida's side with clean cloth that Clara Ara had spent half the night boiling over the fire. Ida was weak, his face pale and drawn, but he was lucid, His jaw was clenched, a testament to the pain he was refusing to show. Clara Ara packed only what was essential: a skin of water, a handful of dried meat, the bone hairpin, and the small pouch of medicinal roots Tever had left behind. Everything else, the small home they had built with their own hands, would have to wait. They would return for it, if they could. They rode in a grim, determined silence, cutting through the rolling hills under a bruised, pre-dawn sky. With every steady hoofbeat, Clara Ara's heart thudded in her chest. But it wasn't a rhythm of fear. It was a drumbeat of resolve. For the first time in her entire life, she wasn't fleeing from something. She was riding toward it. Chaser finally called a halt on a high-rise that overlooked the flatlands. It was a strategic point, where the dusty trail from the fort met the old council route used by the Apache. This, Chaser said, was where the confrontation would happen. This was where Huisa, his ambitious and cruel rival, would lead his band of riders, with the cavalry trailing just far enough behind to maintain the illusion of non-involvement. It was a trap, layered in lies and deceit, designed to ignite a war. Clara Ara stood beside Chaser, her hand shielding her eyes from the glare of the rising sun as she scanned the vast, empty land below. Ida leaned wearily against a stunted tree nearby, his breathing shallow and ragged. "If the council sees me standing beside her," Chaser said, his voice low and tight, "they will assume the worst, that I have betrayed my people for a white woman. And if they see me standing alone," Clara Ara added, her voice just as grim, "they will assume I ran, that I was a willing captive who escaped. Either way," Chaser finished, "Huisa wins." Clara Ara turned to Ida. "Will they listen to you, as an elder?" A faint, bitter smile touched Ida's lips. "They might have," he rasped, "before Huisa declared me dead." Clara Ara swallowed hard. "Then we need more than words," she said, a sudden clarity cutting through her fear. "We need proof, something they can't twist or deny." Chaser looked at her, a question in his eyes. "What kind of proof?" Clara Ara reached into her satchel and pulled out the small, carved mountain cat pendant, the one Chaser's sister had made, a symbol of strength, a symbol of truth. She held it out to him. "Truth," she said. "Memory." Chaser took the pendant, his thumb brushing over the smooth, worn stone. A look of fierce determination settled on his face. "Then we go down together," he said. The sun was high and hot in the sky when they finally appeared. A line of riders, dark specks on the horizon, growing larger with each passing second. There were 7 of them, their figures cloaked in the traditional red and tan of the Apache warriors, and leading them was Huisa. Clara recognized him immediately, even from a distance. His horse was a powerful black stallion, taller and more muscular than the others. He sat upon it with an arrogant pride, his chin jutted forward, his eyes scanning the horizon until they locked onto the 3 figures on the rise. He raised a hand, and his riders slowed to a halt. Moments later, another sound reached them, the creak of wagon wheels and the jingle of harnesses. Another group was approaching from the east, kicking up a cloud of dust. Blue coats, rifles, the cavalry. The trap was set. Chaser turned to Clara Ara, his eyes dark with concern. "Stay behind me." "No," she said, her voice unwavering. "Beside you." He gave a single tight nod. Huisa and his men rode closer, stopping a dozen paces away. "You dare to return?" Huisa called out, his voice laced with a mocking contempt. He gestured toward Clara. "With the one you stole?" Chaser stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "I stole nothing." "She came willingly," Clara Ara added, her voice ringing out clear and strong, making sure the cavalry soldiers could hear. "Your people turned on her before they even knew her name." A cruel smirk twisted Huisa's lips. "And now you speak for the tribe, white woman." "I speak for the truth," she snapped back, her anger overriding her fear. Huisa raised a hand, silencing her with a dismissive gesture. "The council will not accept a white woman as kin. You know this, Chaser. It is our law. Chaser reached into his coat and held up the mountain cat pendant, letting it catch the sunlight. This belonged to my sister, he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power. She gave it to the one who stood beside me when no one else would. If you dishonor Clara Ara, you dishonor the memory of my sister. A murmur went through Wisa's riders. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their saddles, their eyes dropping to the ground. Wisa's smirk faltered for a moment. Clara Ara took another step forward. I am not asking for a place in your tribe, she said, her voice passionate and clear. I am not demanding that your traditions bend for me. I am here because lies are being used to provoke a war, and I will not let my presence be twisted into a reason to spill blood. From the cloud of dust behind them, the cavalry commander rode forward, flanked by 2 soldiers with rifles at the ready. He was an older man, with a graying mustache and cold, calculating eyes. He surveyed the tense scene, his gaze moving from Clara Ara to Chaser, and then to Wisa. What's the situation here? The commander barked. Wisa turned smoothly, his face a mask of false concern. Commander, this Apache has taken a white woman across territorial lines. We are here to retrieve her, as per our agreement. That's a lie! Clara Ara cried out, her anger boiling over. She was traded, Wisa insisted, his voice slick as oil. Without her consent, she has been held against her will. Ida groaned, trying to push himself to his feet. Clara Ara rushed to his side, but Chaser held up a hand, stopping her. Let him speak, Chaser said. The commander raised a skeptical eyebrow. And who is this? My father, Chaser said, his voice ringing with authority. A council elder, an elder that Wisa declared dead so that his lies would not be challenged. The air crackled with tension. Ida, supported by Chaser, took a ragged breath. His voice was weak, but it carried in the silence. Wisa tried to silence me, he rasped, because I warned against this war, because I knew what he was planning. Gasps rippled through the Apache riders. One of them, a broad-shouldered man named Takai, rode forward slightly, his face a mask of confusion. We thought you fell in the gorge, Ida. You thought what Wisa told you to think, Ida shot back, a spark of his old fire returning to his eyes. All eyes turned to Wisa. His face had gone tight with fury, his knuckles white as he gripped his reins. He lies! Wisa hissed. No! A powerful voice rang out from behind them. All heads swiveled. It was Tever. She had appeared as if from nowhere, mounted on her swift pony, her deerskin cloak fluttering in the wind. She rode through the stunned cavalry soldiers and came to a stop between the 2 groups. This is done, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Ida lives, Chaser speaks the truth, and Clara Ara is no enemy. Takai, the broad-shouldered warrior, looked from Tever to Ida, then to Wisa. The truth was plain on his face. He swung his leg over his horse and dismounted, a clear sign of deference to Ida and Tever. One by one, the other riders followed his lead, leaving Wisa sitting alone on his magnificent black horse, isolated and exposed. Tever turned her piercing gaze on him. You will return to the council, she said, her voice cold as ice, and you will answer for this. Wisa didn't speak. He just stared at her, his face a mask of pure hatred. Then, with a savage jerk on the reins, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his pride in tatters. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Ida was gently helped onto a travois, a makeshift stretcher made from blankets and pine poles. The cavalry, their pretext for intervention gone, retreated without another word, their commander shooting a final, grudgingly respectful look at Clara Ara. Chaser and Clara Ara stood side by side, watching as Takai and the other Apache riders began the slow journey back to their village, this time without the dark cloud of doubt and suspicion hanging over them. Tever remained behind. There has been talk, she said, her voice soft now, in the village. Clara Ara looked at her, a weary sigh escaping her lips. What kind of talk? About what you two built, Teva replied, a small smile touching her lips. In the wilderness, about the way you look at each other. Clara Ara blinked, a faint blush rising to her cheeks. Some say, Tever continued, that a love like that is rare, even among our own people. Chaser took Clara Ara's hand in his, their fingers lacing together in a gesture that was both natural and profound. We don't need their approval, he said. No, Tever agreed, but they have asked me to bring you back, not as outsiders, as kin. Clara Ara's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Tever, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Will you come? Tever asked. Chaser looked at Clara Ara, his dark eyes asking a silent question. She looked from his beloved face to the distant mountains, where the village lay waiting. She thought of the journey they had taken, the hardships they had faced, the love they had found in the most unlikely of places. And then, she smiled, a real smile, full of hope and a strength she never knew she possessed. We're ready, she said. They returned to the village not as fugitives, but as heroes. They returned not as a broken woman and a shamed warrior, but as something new, something stronger. They returned as a family, and this time, when Clara Ara stepped into the heart of the village, the eyes that met hers no longer burned with judgment or suspicion. They burned with something else entirely. They burned with understanding, with respect, and with awe. The world hadn't changed, but they had. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. If you were moved by Clara Ara and Chaser's journey from outcasts to heroes, and you believe in the power of truth and love to overcome hatred, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories that will shake you to your core, stories that prove that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can shine brighter than any star. Don't miss out.